The first frost of November 1914 glistened on the fields of Flanders. It clung to the stubble of the unharvested sugar beet crop, to the strands of cobweb strung between bare hedgerows, to the cold, blue steel of a Mauser rifle propped against a farmer's wall. The air was still, carrying the clean, damp smell of turned earth and wood smoke from village chimneys. In a shallow, hurriedly dug scrape in the ground, a young German soldier, Leo, breathed out and watched his breath hang in a cloud before him. He was 20, a carpenter's apprentice from Freiburg, and his fingers, skilled at finding the grain in oak and pine, were now numb around the stock of his rifle. He missed the smell of sawdust. To his left, his friend Matthias, a university student with wire-rimmed glasses now speckled with mud, was trying to light a damp cigarette, his hands shaking. "They said it would be over by Christmas," Matthias whispered, the words a pale ghost in the cold air. Leo just nodded, his eyes fixed on the tree line 300 meters away, where the British Expeditionary Force was doing the exact same thing, waiting, freezing, remembering a different life. That tree line erupted. Not with gunfire, but with sound. A skirl of pipes, thin and fierce and alien against the flat Belgian countryside. Then, a line of men in khaki emerged, not running, but walking. A steady, deliberate advance. The sun, weak and pale, glinted on bayonets fixed to rifles held at the port. For a moment, the Germans in their scrape were silent, mesmerized by the absurd, terrible pageantry of it. This was how war was supposed to be fought, according to the old books. Then an officer's shout, sharp as a whip crack, broke the spell. The rattle of bolt actions. The first volley. The neat line seemed to shudder. Men dropped. The pipes faltered, then screeched on. The advance continued, faster now, becoming a jog, then a ragged charge. Leo found himself firing, reloading, firing again, the rifle kicking against his shoulder, the world narrowing to the circle of his sights, the running shapes, the deafening cacophony that drowned out thought. A man in khaki was suddenly at the lip of their scrape, bayonet descending. Leo saw his face wide, blue eyes, a matted red mustache, a mouth open in a silent scream. Matthias lunged upward with his own bayonet. There was a terrible, soft resistance, then a gasp. The man folded, his weight pulling Matthias off balance. They collapsed together into the mud at the bottom of the hole, the British soldier on top, his blood warm and astonishingly red on Matthias's tunic. The pipes had stopped. The charge was broken, the survivors retreating back to the trees, leaving behind twisted shapes on the frosty beet field. The first silence after battle is the loudest sound a man will ever hear. It rang in Leo's ears as he stared at the dead man's face, inches from his own. The man's eyes were open, clouding. In his pocket, the corner of a photograph peeked out, a woman and two small girls in white dresses, smiling in a sunlit garden. Leo reached out, his hand trembling violently, and gently closed the man's eyelids. "Forgive me," he murmured in German, a language the dead man would never understand. Matthias was weeping silently, his body shaking with great, heaving sobs he couldn't control. This was the first lesson: war was not an abstraction in a newspaper. It was the weight of a dead stranger on your legs, the specific, intimate smell of his blood, and the haunting permanence of the photograph in his pocket. The war quickly learned it could not sustain such open, dramatic gestures. The energy of movement bled out into the earth by the end of 1914, replaced by a terrible, exhausted stasis. The charge gave way to the shovel. Men who had come to fight for glory dug instead for survival. The trenches grew from scrapes into elaborate, sinuous cities of mud that scarred the continent from the North Sea to the Swiss border. They were mirrors facing each other across a strip of tortured earth called no man's land. Life contracted into a narrow, vertical world. The sky was a strip of gray or blue above the parapet. The horizon was the opposing trench's fire step. The universe was the few feet of dirt wall in front of your face. In a British trench near Ypres, a world away from Leo's scrape, Tomo adjusted the sandbag that had been knocked loose by a sniper's round. He was a London clerk, his pale skin now permanently grimmed, his fingers once stained with ink now stained with cordite and dirt. The trench was a living, stinking entity. Its floor was a slurry of mud, rotting duckboards, discarded tins, and worse. Its walls oozed moisture, and the constant digging revealed fragments of the past life of this land, a shard of Roman pottery, a rusted medieval horseshoe, the skeleton of a sheep. The present was a collage of desperate improvisation. Ammunition boxes became shelves, shell casings became candle holders, gas masks hung from nails like grotesque fruit. The soundtrack was a symphony of discomfort, the constant drip of water, the scuttle of rats, the distant, monotonous thump of artillery, the closer crack of a sniper's rifle. Time lost meaning. It was measured in watches, 2 hours on sentry duty, staring into the shifting shadows of no man's land, imagination turning stumps into crawling enemies. 4 hours of fatigue, carrying rations or ammunition through communication trenches that were often thigh-deep in icy, foul water. A few precious hours of fitful sleep in a dugout carved into the side of the trench, where the air was thick with the smell of damp earth, unwashed men, and chloride of lime. The men adapted. They built a culture in the mud. They gave names to their trench sections: Piccadilly, Regent Street, Hellfire Corner. They crafted beautiful, intricate trench art from spent brass shell casings, polished vases, letter openers, detailed models of biplanes. It was an act of defiance, of asserting creativity in a world dedicated to destruction. They sang. Not patriotic anthems, but sentimental music hall songs, hymns from childhood, and dark, cynical ditties of their own making. I don't want to be a soldier, I don't want to go to war, I'd rather hang around Piccadilly Underground, living off the earnings of a high-born lady. The songs were a lifeline, a shared heartbeat in the dark. But the darkness always pressed in. Stand to at dawn was a ritual of cold terror. In the half-light, every man would line the fire step, bayonet fixed, peering into the gloom. Was that a moving shadow? A glint of wire? The tension was a physical wire strung along the trench. Then, sometimes, the whistle would blow. Not a human whistle, but the piercing shriek of an officer's signal. Up the ladders, over the top, into the grey hell of no man's land. No man's land was the true face of the war. It was a state of being, a kingdom of the dead. It was a desolate, cratered landscape where nature had been murdered. Trees were reduced to shattered, blackened stumps. The earth was a chaos of overlapping shell holes, some as big as houses, filled with oily, greenish water that reflected the broken sky. Tangled, rusty thickets of barbed wire coiled everywhere, snagging the light and anything that tried to pass. And the dead were everywhere. They lay where they fell, in the grotesque, frozen poses of their last moments. After weeks, they became part of the ecosystem. Uniforms bleached by sun and rain. Flesh gave way to the work of rats and flies, leaving behind grinning skulls that seemed to watch the living with hollow, knowing amusement. Men gave them names. Old Jerry by the shattered oak. The Zouave in the red trousers. They became landmarks, macabre signposts in a country no one wanted to cross. The smell was a physical presence, a sweet, cloying, rotten sweet stench that clung to clothes and hair and memory, carried on the wind to remind you, always, of what lay between the lines. Crossing it was an exercise in controlled nightmare. Tomo's first time over was a raid, a small, violent incursion to capture prisoners or gather intelligence. His mouth was dry as chalk, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The artillery laid down a box barrage to isolate the target trench. The world dissolved into sound and concussion. Then they went, scrambling up ladders slick with mud, dropping into the cratered moonscape. The noise was overwhelming, the crump of their own shells landing ahead, the ripping cloth sound of German machine guns from the flanks, the whine and crack of bullets, the shouts and screams. He tripped over something soft, a body, months old, mostly skeleton in a uniform. He fell into a shell hole, landing in freezing water up to his chest. Next to him floated a dead rat, bloated and pale. He gagged, scrambled out. A flare went up, a brilliant magnesium white that turned the world into a stark, frozen tableau of shadows and running men. He saw his friend, Billy, cut down by a burst of machine gun fire, his body dancing before collapsing. He kept moving, driven by pure, animal terror. They reached the German wire. It was uncut, despite the bombardment. They used wire cutters, their hands ripped and bleeding. A man next to him was hit, crying out for his mother as he bled into the mud. Finally, they tumbled into the enemy trench. It was empty, abandoned. They had taken nothing. They left with 2 prisoners, scared teenage boys who looked as confused and horrified as Tomo felt. Carrying a wounded commander, they stumbled back through the hellscape as dawn broke, grey and indifferent. They had lost 8 men. For nothing. Tomo sat in the trench afterward, staring at his bloody, shaking hands, unable to speak. He had crossed into the kingdom of the dead and returned, but he had left a part of himself there, tangled in the wire. The war was not just the infantryman's world of mud and wire. It learned to fly. In 1914, airplanes were Curiosity's flimsy contraptions of wood, wire, and canvas used for spotting artillery. Pilots, gentlemen adventurers, would wave cheerily to each other as they passed. By 1915, they carried pistols and rifles. By 1916, synchronized machine guns that fired through the propeller arc turned the sky into a new kind of battlefield. In a French airfield behind Verdun, Jean-Claude Jacquelemare tightened the scarf around his neck. The cold at 3,000 meters was a brutal, penetrating thing. His Nieuport 17 scout plane, painted with a bright blue devil on the fuselage, looked like a toy, a kite made of painted linen stretched over a wooden skeleton. But it was a killing machine. His mechanic, a grizzled old Breton named Gaspard, handed him a thermos of bitter, scalding coffee. Bonne chance, mon capitaine. Jacques winked, his face already alive with the fierce joy of flight. He was an artist of the air, a hunter. Taking off was a battle against gravity and crosswind. Then, the world fell away. The rumble of the engine, the bite of the wind, the earth shrinking into a patchwork of green fields, brown trenches, and the black scars of shelling. It was clean up here. Beautiful. From this height, the war looked like a map, a tactical puzzle, not the mud and blood reality. The radio crackled. A patrol of German 2-seater observation planes, protected by a pair of Albatros T.2 fighters. Jacques pushed the stick forward, his stomach lurching as he dove, the wind screaming in the wires. The fight was a swirling, chaotic ballet. He came at a 2-seater from below and behind, its blind spot. He could see the observer swinging his parabellum machine gun, the pilot's leather helmeted head turning. He thumbed the trigger. His twin Vickers guns chattered, a sound swallowed by the engine roar. Tracers stitched across the German plane's wing. It peeled away, smoke streaming. He banked hard left, searching for the Albatros. There. A grey shape with black crosses diving on his wingman, Pierre. Jacques turned into the attack, firing a deflection shot. He missed. The Albatros pulled up, and for a second, Jacques saw the pilot's face, young, clean-shaven, goggles reflecting the sky. They were close enough to see each other's expressions. The German nodded, a quick, professional acknowledgement, then rolled away. It was still a duel, a nightly contest. But that was changing. The planes got faster, more heavily armed. The Fokker Dr. I triplane, the Spad-13, the Sop with Camel, each new model was deadlier than the last. The chivalry began to curdle. Jacques saw a German plane set on fire, spiraling down, a torch against the grey sky. He saw the pilot try to climb out, a tiny, struggling figure, then fall, a black speck tumbling through the clouds. There were no parachutes. Falling was a long, silent scream. Jacques landed that evening, his hands still trembling from the adrenaline. Gaspard pointed to 3 new bullet holes in the fuselage. Jacques just nodded, lit a cigarette, and stared at the sunset, which looked like fire on the horizon. The clean war in the sky was getting dirty. The war learned to swim, to lurk beneath the waves. In the cold, dark silence of the North Sea, 30 meters below the surface, the U-19 waited. Inside, the world was a dripping, sweating metal tube. The air was a thick fog of diesel fumes, sweat, cooked cabbage, and the faint, ever-present scent of feet. The heat from the engines made condensation run down the curved steel walls. Every surface was beaded with moisture. Every sound was magnified and analyzed, the ping of Allied hydrophones searching, the distant, throbbing beat of a ship's screws. Kapitän-Lieutenant Otto von Kleist peered through the eyepieces of the attack periscope, its lens just breaking the choppy surface. The image was monochrome, shaky. A merchant steamer, plodding along, its stack blowing black coal smoke. No flag visible. It could be British, French, neutral. The rules of prize warfare - stopping and searching were a luxury that risked destruction by armed Q-ships or patrol boats. The new orders were stark, unrestricted submarine warfare. Sink on sight. Stand by forward tube 1, Otto said, his voice calm in the crowded control room. The crew moved with quiet efficiency. A young torpedo mate, Klaus, his face pale and beaded with sweat, watched the dials. He was 19, from a fishing village. He used to mend nets with his father. Now he tended to steal fish that carried 200 kilograms of high explosive. Solution set, the executive officer murmured. Otto took a final look. He saw figures on the deck. Tiny, human. He thought of his brother, a merchant marine officer. He pushed the thought away. This was duty. This was war. Fire. A hiss of compressed air. A slight lurch. The torpedo was away. The crew stood frozen, counting silently. The only sound was the electric hum of the motors and the frantic beating of their own hearts. 20 seconds. 30. A muffled, distant crump echoed through the hull, a sound felt in the bones more than heard. On the surface, through the periscope, the ship shuddered. A fountain of white water erupted amidships. It took on an immediate, heavy list. The figures on deck scrambled, tiny ants in panic. Lifeboats were lowered, sliding down the steep penning deck. The ship's stern began to rise, screws churning the air. Otto kept the periscope up. He had to confirm the kill, to report the tonnage sunk. He watched as the ship slid under, the waves closing over its funnel with a final, sucking sigh. The lifeboats, now dots on the water, pulled away. He ordered the periscope down. Take us down to 60 meters course north-northwest. The boat tilted. No one spoke. Klaus was staring at the deck, his jaw clenched tight. Otto retreated to his tiny curtained cabin. On his small desk, next to the charts and logs, was a photograph of his wife and infant daughter. He touched the frame, his fingers leaving smudges on the glass. Then he picked up his pen to record the kill. SS Penelope, estimated 5,000 GRT, sunk 54 degrees 12 minutes north, 4 degree 33 E. The numbers were clean. The memory of the rising stern, the tiny figures, was not. The war beneath the waves was a silent, clinical autopsy on the world above. The war came home. It did not arrive on battle maps, but on cheap, yellow telegraph paper. In a small stone cottage in the Scottish Highlands, Morag MacLeod heard the knock at the door. She was kneading dough for bread, her hands floury, a strand of grey hair stuck to her damp forehead. Her son, Alistair, her youngest, was in France with the 51st Highland Division. She wiped her hands on her apron, her heart suddenly a cold stone in her chest. The boy at the door was too young for the army, his face solemn, his cap in his hand. He didn't need to speak. She saw it in his eyes, in the way he held the buff-colored envelope. Mrs. MacLeod. The War Office regrets to inform you. The words blurred into a roaring in her ears. The floor tilted. The dough, half-formed, fell to the stone floor with a soft, final thud. She did not scream. She made no sound at all. She sank onto the chair by the hearth, the unlit peat fire cold and grey. She stared at the photograph on the mantelpiece. Alistair in his kilt and Glengarry, grinning, his whole life ahead of him. The boy left quietly, closing the door on the immense, echoing silence that now filled the cottage. Down the lane, in other houses, other women received the same knock, The same words. A street of grief. The war was not just at the front, it was in the hollow silence of empty chairs, in the untouched beds, in the faces in photographs that would never age a day beyond 19. The home front became a front of its own. In Berlin, during the turnip winter of 1917, the blockade was a slow, cold strangulation. The markets were empty. Rations shrank to almost nothing. A queue of women, their faces pinched and pale, stretched around a block, waiting for a distribution of watery turnip soup and a few ounces of black, sawdust-filled bread. Their children, listless and thin, clung to their skirts. An old man in the queue simply sat down on the curb and did not get up again. He was too tired, too hungry. He was carried away. The propaganda posters showed brave soldiers and promised victory, but the hollow eyes of the children told a different story. In Paris, in London, women filled the factories. They traded aprons for overalls, their hair tied back in scarves, their faces set in lines of grim determination. They worked lathes and presses, filling shells with high explosive. They became tram conductors, police officers, farm laborers. The world of men was absent, and the world of women expanded to fill the void, bearing the double burden of work and waiting, of making the tools of destruction while praying they wouldn't be used on their loved ones. And the battles? They were not battles anymore, they were seismic events, forces of nature given human names. Verdun. The Germans called it Operation Gericht, Operation Judgment. The French called it the Mill on the Meuse. The objective was not territory, but annihilation. To bleed France white, said the German commander. For 10 months in 1916, two armies fed themselves into a meat grinder over a few square miles of shell-blasted forest and shattered forts. The bombardment was continuous, a never-ending earthquake that turned the earth to powder. Men lived in cellars, in shell holes, in the ruins of forts like Douaumont and Vaux. They fought over a single trench, a ruined village, a crossroads. They died of thirst, of wounds, of madness. The French motto, "Ils ne passeront pas." They shall not pass. And they did not. But the cost. Over 300,000 dead. A French lieutenant, found wandering in the ruins of Fleury, his uniform in tatters, was scribbling the same phrase over and over in a mud-stained notebook: "The earth is made of bones. The earth is made of bones." He was not wrong. At the ossuary at Douaumont, the bones of 130,000 unidentified French and German soldiers are mingled together in a single, silent tomb. Judgment had come, and it had judged everyone guilty. The Somme. The British big push to relieve Verdun. A week-long artillery bombardment, the greatest in history to that point, over 1.7 million shells fired. It was supposed to cut the wire, kill the Germans in their deep bunkers, and leave the infantry to walk across and occupy the empty trenches. At 7:30 a.m. on July 1, 1916, along an 18-mile front, whistles blew. Thousands of British soldiers, many of them volunteers from PALS battalions, men who had enlisted together from the same streets, factories, and football clubs, climbed out of their trenches and began to walk. They were laden with 60 pounds of equipment. They advanced in neat, ordered lines. They were met not by silence, but by a storm of steel. The wire was not cut. The Germans were not dead. They emerged from deep, reinforced bunkers, manned their machine guns, and opened fire. The walking men were scythed down in rows. By the end of that single, beautiful summer's day, the British Army had suffered 57,470 casualties, with 19,240 men killed. It remains the bloodiest day in British military history. In the Newfoundland Trench at Beaumont Hamel, the 1st Newfoundland Regiment was virtually annihilated in less than 30 minutes. A football pitch of men, gone. The PALS battalions from Accrington, Leeds, Sheffield, were decimated. Whole streets in northern English towns were draped in black crepe. The telegram boy became the most feared figure in the kingdom. The Somme ground on for 5 months, gaining a few miles of mud at a cost of over 1 million casualties on all sides. It was not a battle, it was an industrial process. Raw material went in at one end. Statistics came out the other. The product was a wasteland. Passchendaele, 1917. The Third Battle of Ypres. If the Somme was an industrial process, Passchendaele was a descent into a primeval, liquid hell. The rain began in late July and barely stopped for 3 months. The battlefield, already churned by millions of shells, became a vast, shallow lake of liquid mud. Shell craters overlapped, creating a landscape of interconnected pools of filthy, often chemical-laced water. Men drowned in it. Wounded men, slipping from stretchers, would sink and disappear before their comrades' eyes. Guns sank into the mire. Tanks, the new, hulking land ships, became immobile steel coffins. Advances were measured in yards, paid for in thousands of lives. The objective was a ridge, a slight rise in the ground crowned by the ruins of a village. It was taken, eventually, by Canadian troops in November. The cost, over 500,000 casualties. A British staff officer, visiting the front after the battle, is said to have broken down in tears. "Good God," he whispered, "did we really send men to fight in that?" A Canadian medic, writing home, said simply, "This is not war. This is the end of the world." And through it all, the small, fragile lights of humanity refused to be extinguished. The Christmas Truce of 1914 was the most famous flicker. In sectors across the front, as Christmas Eve fell, German troops began placing candles on their parapets and singing Stille Nacht. British troops responded with the first Noel. Then, tentatively, unarmed men climbed out into no man's land. They shook hands. They exchanged gifts, cigarettes for chocolate, plum pudding for sausage. They showed photographs of families. They played football with a makeshift ball. They buried their dead together, enemy and comrade side by side. For a few hours, the war ceased to exist. It was a miracle of shared humanity, a glimpse of the peace that could be. The high commands on both sides were horrified. Orders were issued. Such fraternization was strictly forbidden. It never happened on that scale again. But for the men who were there, it became the central, defining memory of the war, not of horror, but of a fleeting, profound peace. There were smaller moments, every day. The live and let live systems that developed in quiet sectors. An agreement not to shell the latrine areas at certain times. A British and German sentry calling out to each other at night. "You all right, Tommy? Still here, Fritz? Cold, ain't it?" A shared complaint about the rations, the officers, the rain. The war was a machine, but the men in it were not cogs. They were human beings, and they forged connections, however fragile, across the barbed wire. The care for animals spoke volumes. The messenger dogs, trained to run through hell to deliver vital maps or orders, were cherished. A wounded dog would be tended with the same care as a wounded man. Regimental mascots, goats, bears, dogs, even a lion cub, were beloved symbols of unit pride and a link to a saner world. The bond between a cavalryman and his horse endured even as the cavalry charge became a suicidal anachronism in the age of the machine gun. The horses suffered horribly, shelled, gassed, worked to death, and their suffering was felt deeply by the men who depended on them. Humanity, it seemed, could be measured in the kindness shown to creatures even more helpless than themselves. But the darkness had new weapons. The introduction of poison gas at the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915 was a watershed, a descent into a new, previously unimagined circle of hell. First came chlorine, released from thousands of canisters when the wind was right. A strange, greenish-yellow cloud, smelling of pineapples and pepper, would roll across the ground, heavier than air, pouring into trenches. Men who inhaled it felt a searing pain in their lungs, as if they were drowning on dry land. Their bodies produced fluid to combat the irritation, and they literally drowned in the fluid of their own burnt lung tissue. The sight of gasping, choking men, their faces turning blue, vomiting, clawing at their throats, was a new kind of horror. The Allies soon developed crude respirators, cotton pads soaked in urine. Then came phosgene, deadlier and less detectable. Then, worst of all, mustard gas, introduced by the Germans in 1917. It was an oily, yellow-brown mist that didn't need to be inhaled. It soaked through clothing, burning the skin, causing massive, painful blisters. It blinded men, sometimes temporarily, sometimes permanently. It attacked the bronchial tubes, leading to a slow, agonizing death days after exposure. Gas masks became a standard, grotesque part of the uniform, turning soldiers into insect-eyed monsters. The fear of gas was pervasive, paralyzing. The rattle of gas alarm tins clang 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 would send men into a frantic scramble, the world reduced to the sound of their own panicked, filtered breathing and the hammering of their hearts. Gas removed the last vestige of the soldierly duel. It was anonymous, indiscriminate, cruel. It was the Industrial Revolution applied to slaughter. The war was a machine, and it was breaking its operators. By 1917, the strain was showing everywhere. The French army, after the catastrophic, bloody failure of the Nivelle offensive, mutinied. Entire divisions refused to go over the top again. They would hold the line, they said, but they would not attack. They were not cowards, they were simply finished, pushed beyond human endurance. The mutiny was kept secret from the Germans at all costs. The ringleaders were shot, but the new commander, General Pétain, understood. He improved conditions, granted more leave, and promised no more grand, suicidal offensives. He saved the army by refusing to spend it. The Russian front collapsed entirely. The Tsar was overthrown. The new provisional government tried to keep fighting, but the Russian people were done. The Bolsheviks promised peace, land, and bread. They seized power and signed a separate, humiliating peace with Germany at Brest-Litovsk, surrendering vast territories. The Eastern Front fell silent, freeing 1 million German veterans for the West. Germany made its last, desperate gamble in the spring of 1918, the Kaiserschlacht, the Emperor's Battle. Using new stormtrooper tactics, small, fast-moving units of elite soldiers armed with light machine guns, flamethrowers, and grenades, infiltrating weak points, bypassing strongholds, spreading chaos deep behind the lines, they smashed through the Allied front. For the first time since 1914, the war became mobile again. The Germans advanced miles, they saw green fields untouched by shells. They captured Allied supply dumps brimming with food, tobacco, and warm clothing. For soldiers who had known only privation and stalemate, it was a heady, intoxicating moment. Could they actually win? In a captured British bunker, a German stormtrooper named Karl found a tin of English plum pudding. He sat on an abandoned ammunition box and ate it with his fingers, the rich, sweet taste exploding on his tongue. He closed his eyes. For a moment, he was a boy again, at Christmas. Then a shell landed nearby, shaking dirt from the ceiling. The dream evaporated. The advance had outrun its supplies. The men were exhausted. And now, a new, seemingly endless flood of fresh troops was entering the line, the Americans. The American Expeditionary Forces under General John J. Pershing arrived with the boundless confidence of a nation untouched by the years of slaughter. The doughboys were well fed, well equipped, and they believed, with absolute certainty, that they could win the war. Their energy was a shock to the weary Europeans. They attacked with a ferocity that sometimes bordered on recklessness. At Belleau Wood, the U.S. Marines fought a brutal, tree-by-tree battle against entrenched German veterans. The German defenders, impressed by their courage but appalled by their tactics, called them Teufelsschunde-devil dogs. The American infusion was the tipping point. The German spring offensive stalled, then faltered. In August 1918, at the Battle of Amiens, the Allies, led by tanks and coordinated air power, began a relentless advance that the Germans could not stop. This was the 100 Days Offensive. The German army, its spirit broken, its men starving and disillusioned, began a long, fighting retreat. The home front in Germany collapsed into revolution. Sailors mutinied at Kiel. Soviets formed in major cities. The Kaiser abdicated, fleeing to Holland. A new German Republic was proclaimed. And then, the silence. It was scheduled. Negotiated. A ceasefire, an armistice, to begin at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. In the minutes leading up to 11 a.m. on November 11, 1918, the war raged with a bitter, pointless fury. Commanders, knowing the end was coming, ordered attacks to secure last-minute advantages, to gain better positions for the peace talks. Men died for a field, a village, a few hundred yards of mud, with the clock ticking down. A Canadian private, George, was hit by a sniper's bullet at 10:58 a.m. He bled out in the mud, his watch stopped at 10:59. He was one of the last. Then, as if a giant hand had flipped a switch across the continent, the gun stopped. The silence was deafening. It was a physical presence, heavy and profound. Men stood in their trenches, stunned. Their ears, accustomed to constant noise, rang in the void. They looked at each other, bewildered. Was it real? Cautiously, a British soldier peered over the parapet. Then a German. They climbed out. Others followed. They met in the middle of no man's land, this cursed strip of earth that had been the ventricle of the war's heart. They did not speak. They had no words for this. They simply looked at each other's faces drawn, exhausted, etched with the same memories of mud, wire, and death. They saw not enemies, but fellow survivors. A German officer, his uniform threadbare, produced a silver cigarette case. He offered it to a British sergeant. The sergeant took a cigarette. They lit them with a shared match, the flame trembling in unsteady hands. They nodded. All along the line, men were emerging. They exchanged tokens, buttons, belt buckles, caps. They shook hands. Some laughed, a sound strange and rusty. Some wept openly. Some just sat on the crater lips, staring at the grey sky, trying to understand that they might see tomorrow. The news traveled down the roads, through the villages, across the seas. In London, Paris, New York, the bells rang out not in mourning, but in a wild, chaotic carillon of joy. People poured into the streets, weeping, laughing, dancing. Strangers kissed. Confetti, made of shredded newspapers and telephone books, rained from windows. Bands played. But in the midst of the delirium, there were islands of stillness. The woman who stood on her doorstep, arms wrapped tightly around herself, watching the celebration with dry, empty eyes. Her 3 sons were buried in France. The victory was not for her. The old man in the quiet corner of a pub, turning a battered pocket watch over and over in his hands, his son's watch, returned with his personal effects. The silence in the homes with the gold stars in the windows was louder than any cheering crowd. The men came home, but they brought the war with them. They came back to wives who had become strangers, to children born while they were away who shied from the haunted-looking man they were told to call father. They came back to jobs that no longer existed, to a world that had moved on, that wanted to forget the nightmare and get on with the roaring 20s. Some wore their scars visibly, the empty sleeve pinned up, the eye patch, the limp, the gaunt face from years of starvation and fear. Others wore their scars inside, where they festered. The nightmares that jerked them awake screaming. The involuntary duck at a car backfiring. The inability to be in a crowd. The distant stare. They called it shell shock. Today we would call it post-traumatic stress disorder. Their souls had been wounded, and there was no bandage for that. They were the walking wounded, a generation of ghosts in a world of the living. The world tried to heal. The maps were redrawn in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. The Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires were carved up into new nations. Germany was blamed, humiliated, forced to pay crippling reparations. They called it the war to end all wars. They built monuments, soaring arches, weeping bronze soldiers, tombs for the unknown warrior. They wore red poppies, which bloomed in the churned earth of Flanders, as a symbol of remembrance. They vowed never again. But the peace was brittle, built on vengeance and a desperate desire to return to a world that no longer existed. The seeds of the next, greater catastrophe were planted in the very soil meant to nurture eternal peace. The innocence was gone. The faith in progress, in kings, in the old order, had been blown apart on the wire of the Somme, drowned in the mud of Passchendaele, gassed in the fields of Ypres. A dark, cynical modern age had been born in the trenches. The camera pulls back, higher and higher, leaving the soldiers in no man's land, their cigarette smoke mingling in the cold air. We see the trench lines from above, a vast, serpentine scar across the body of Europe. We see the endless rows of white crosses in the cemeteries at Tyne-Cot, at Douaumont, at Arlington. We see the old veterans in their parades, their chests heavy with medals, their eyes seeing a different time. We see the young faces in the faded photographs on mantelpieces, forever smiling, forever 19. We end as we began. With a close-up. Not of a painting, but of a hand. An old, wrinkled hand, spotted with age. It holds a simple, white stone. The hand places the stone gently on top of a low, grey wall. The wall is the Menin Gate at Ypres, and it is covered, every inch, in names. 54,395 names. Names of British and Commonwealth soldiers with no known grave. The old hand traces one name with a trembling finger. The name is lost among the thousands, but to this hand, it is the only one. The hand withdraws. The camera pulls back from the gate, from the names, from the city. We see a field in Flanders, today. It is spring. The grass is green and lush. The sky is a perfect, clean blue. Red poppies sway in the breeze among the wheat. A farmer is plowing. His tractor hums. The earth turns over, rich and dark. And as it turns, it yields not just soil, but rusted metal, a twisted piece of shrapnel, a corroded bullet casing, the fragile, brown ribs of a decayed leather boot. This is the iron harvest. Every year, the fields of France and Belgium give up the last, metallic bones of the war. The farmer stops his tractor, picks up the shell fragment, and adds it to a pile by the edge of his field, a pile that will be collected by the bomb disposal unit. The war is not over. It is just sleeping, slowly being returned to the earth, piece by rusted piece. The green field fills the screen. The sound of the tractor fades. The wind rustles the poppies.